Hi everyone. I like to call these little lecture reviews more from Dr. Morey, and I'm not going to read every point on these slideshows. I'm just going to go over some of the most important material and kind of expand upon certain aspects of the work. So for this first more from Dr. Morey, we're going to cover the first part of chapter 1, which is on the introduction and history of psychology. So what we know about psychology as a field is what is psychology. We've talked about this in the first kind of intro or start here video. So it's the scientific study of the mind and behavior. We use the scientific method. Why should you study psychology? So I know that not everyone taking this course will plan to be a psychology major, but you can still get a ton out of this course that'll be relevant to any field. So you can recognize your internal biases, learn to ask appropriate questions, make good observations of other people, and just better understand behavior and thought. That will serve you in any aspect, any relationship, career, anything that you'll do in the future. Psychology will serve you. So to talk about how we got psychology, what we call psychology has a long past, which means we trace our roots way, way back into philosophy, but a short history. So we're actually a pretty new science. Our roots are in philosophy, mainly this nature versus nurture debate. So with this, we're kind of curious as to how much is inborn in people versus how much of ourselves we get from the environment. So how much of your personality, for example, is something you're born with versus how much are you shaped by other forces in the environment. So it wasn't until the late 1800s that psychology was its own discipline. We're termed a social science as it's the science is all about how we relate to others. If you ask people, who the founder of psychology is, I bet most times you would get Sigmund Freud. But if you ask a psychologist, we don't trace Sigmund Freud or don't call him our ancestor. We really say Wilhelm Wundt and William James. Wilhelm Wundt and William James are our founders. So Wundt, he actually wrote the first psychology textbook. He opened the first psychological lab in 1879. And he used a method that we really don't use as much as a field anymore, but it was called introspection. So what he might do is show someone in his lab a photo like this one and ask them to report on all of their sensations, their feelings when viewing this photograph. So how does this make you feel? Do you feel disgusted? Do you feel excited? Do you feel nervous? But as you might imagine, because we're reporting on internal states, it's not very objective. In fact, it's quite subjective. So if you say, I feel excited, I can't say for sure that you do or don't feel excited because it's all subjective. So it wasn't a perfect method, but it got us started. William James, in a little bit of contrast, he really brought us into the observable phenomenon, more of that objective stuff. So he was an American psychologist, really heavily influenced through Darwin, and he thought that what we should be studying is the function of behavior. So he said, really, if you see a behavior, it has some kind of function. So if you see someone smoking a cigarette, that has a function. If you see somebody punching someone else, that has a function. So any kind of behavior that could be hard to explain really should have some function for that individual. So he did use introspection, but also really brought us into objective measures. So we briefly mentioned Freud. Freud is a really important founder of psychology. He just wasn't our founding father, who we kind of call the beginning of psychology. But he brought us into something called psychoanalytic theory, which really looked more at this unconscious mind, this idea that we all have these things that are pushed down deep into us that we're not really aware of. He used techniques like analyzing one's dreams, free association, which was pretty much someone laying on a couch and just saying everything that came to mind, and then really was interested in things like Freudian slips, which is where you say one thing but mean your mother. So you're talking, but then something comes out of your mouth that you didn't actually mean. Like, you might be saying, oh man, I'm so happy to be at work is what you mean to say, but you're like, man, it's so crappy to be at work. It's like, oops, Freudian slip. You said what you were really feeling, that your work is crappy. So that's a Freudian slip. He focused on those things. And he thought a lot of our important psychological characteristics focused or came from the childhood. So this was a perspective then that dominated for decades. A couple important other individuals, G. Stanley Hall, he opened up our first psych lab in the U.S. Mary Whiton Calkins, she, did everything that she needed to do to earn the PhD, but was not given the PhD because she was a woman. So Margaret Floyd Washburn was the first one to actually receive her PhD. And then Francis Sumner was the first African American to receive a PhD. So he got that from Clark. So some really important people in our past and our history. Another important historical perspective is Gestalt psychology. So this kind of came out of this perspective that we are more than the sum of our parts. So that's kind of their big phrase. So it deals with the whole rather than individual parts. So if you look at some of these little graphics here for the Gestalt effects, for the most part you're going to see a box or a cube outlined in that first picture, but really there's no cube there, it's just white space in the black circles. For the very last, or the middle one, you'll see a puppy dog. For the last one, you'll see a panda. But what the Gestalt effect is that these things are actually just individual pieces. There's no outline connecting them all, but our brain forms that outline. So we see the whole more than just those little itty-bitty pieces. So this was really influential in sensation and perception research. Behaviorism was a perspective that took over some of that psychoanalytic perspective and really focused on behavior. So behaviorism, it focused on behavior. So some of our big founding fathers there were Pavlov, Watson, Skinner. We'll talk more about these individuals. But they're really interested in studying learned behaviors. So things that you've learned from your environment. We've all learned, many, many different things from our environment, not just in school, but in every aspect of life. So if you see the big golden arches, you've learned that you can get a delicious Happy Meal from there. So you've made that association. If I go to McDonald's, I can receive a toy with my chicken nuggets. So you've learned that. So that's what behaviorists would study. They studied a lot of animal research and really led to a lot of important research. You may have heard of Pavlov, so we'll talk more about this research, these individuals in depth. But Pavlov did a groundbreaking study with dogs. He realized that he could help them or kind of condition them, which we call classical conditioning now, to salivate to the sound of a bell. So he'd pair the bell and the food, the bell and the food, the bell and the food, over and over and over until the dogs would eventually learn, I hear a bell, I can expect my food. And they'd start to salivate just with hearing a bell. So, this is really important work. We'll talk a lot more about this in the class. John Watson was an American psychologist. He thought that behavior was really what we need to focus on. Anything else was in the black box in here in our mind. We can't study it. Only thing we can study is behavior. This kind of quote will tell you a little bit about who John Watson is. So he really believed that he could take anybody and raise them to be anything. So the environment is the only thing that matters to Watson. Nothing inborn mattered. Skinner is a psychologist. He really worked, you might have heard of a Skinner box. He worked a lot with animals, but he studied operant conditioning. So if we apply a reinforcement, if we give you something you like, maybe a sticker or a cookie, then you might do that behavior more. If you receive a punishment, like a shock or, a fun thing taken away from you, then you'll do that behavior less. So we'll get really far into this in our learning unit, but just to mention, Skinner really was our founding father for operant conditioning. Humanism is another kind of field of study in psychology. And so with these individuals, Maslow and Rogers are two of our big founding fathers for this, but they really emphasized the potential for good. So they believed in the good of people. They thought it was innate in all individuals. And they would look at things like personal control and really just had this optimistic view of people, that they can solve their own problems, that they're worthy and capable. So Maslow, you might have heard of him with this hierarchy of needs. So he said we had to meet our physiological needs before we can meet our safety needs and so on and so forth. And we'd get to the top, which was self-actualization. So in self-actualization, we kind of got to be all we could be. The best, the top, the most important, most valuable part of ourselves was expressed. So many of us won't get there to self-actualization, but Maslow thought this was something we were all striving for. Rogers was a really interesting guy. He was a humanist, so he emphasized the potential for good, but he really believed that therapy should be client-centered. So that's a different word. It's not patient-centered, it's client-centered. So focused on the client. And it has to include things like regarding people positively no matter what, being genuine towards them, and showing empathy. So being empathetic for people's experiences. The cognitive revolution is something interesting. So with this, we're kind of moving out of just the behavior, the brain is this black box, and instead looking at, really the mind again. So bringing in some of that information reincorporating mental functioning. So Noam Chomsky was someone who was really interested in kind of what's going on up here. So not just what we can see, not things that are tangible, but really what's going on up in this black box. Another really interesting field of study is multicultural psychology or cross-cultural psychology. So with this, the emphasis is on studying group differences. So trying to understand how people differ from one another, including things like studying African American psychology or this collectivist versus individualistic difference here. So, people from the United States are often individualistic. Those from Asian cultures are often collectivist. So what are the differences there? And then really trying to avoid ethnocentrism, which is this belief that one's own culture is superior to others. So psychology does have a real problem with being weird. So in this case, most of our research is focused on Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic peoples. So it's weird. It's something that's not representative of all individuals and all experiences. So psychology really needs to diversify as a field to kind of get more of this exposure. So from contemporary psychology, we followed all the way up through our long past, and now when you study psychology now, there's many different areas of study. So the very next one we're going to get into in Module 2 is on biopsychology. So that's kind of the biology-psychology mix. So understanding the body and its influence and evolutionary psych. Sensation and perception is kind of what we see, hear, smell, and how we perceive that information. Cognitive is thought processes. Developmental is studying the human often from womb to tomb, from birth to death. Personality is kind of that unchanging nature of who we are. Social psychology is people in groups. Industrial organizational psychology includes kind of people in the workplace, is often where that's used. Health psychology has to do with the thoughts, feelings, behaviors that we have and how that impacts our physical and mental health. Sport and exercise psych, we have psychologists who will go into, work with athletes and work with individuals who do sports and exercise to help them really, do the best that they can do there, keep their mental state, their physical functioning at its peak. Clinical psych is kind of that counseling aspect or working with individuals with mental disorders. Forensic psychology is often trying to understand either people who commit crimes or ways we can reduce crime. It's kind of working in that aspect. And so careers in psychology, there's many things you could do with this. So a psychologist and a psychiatrist are different. A psychologist studies psychology. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who then specializes in clinical psych. A PhD is a research degree. A PsyD is more of an applied degree. And there's lots of jobs that you could get with a bachelor's, so things like sales, social work, HR, these are all things that are very common with psychology degrees. And you can review that chart, kind of see where psychology individuals or psychology majors end up. But that's a little more from Dr. Morey on Chapter 1. Thanks.